Westminster Abbey, 2nd June, 1953. The coronation of Queen Elizabeth II has just ended. Outside, in the forecourt, the crowds are still pressing against the barriers. Princess Margaret, 22 years old, in white gloves, standing near the Abbey door, reaches up and brushes a piece of lint from the uniform of Group Captain Peter Townsend. 2 seconds, perhaps less. A tabloid reporter files the observation. By morning, it has crossed the Atlantic. That gesture is where the story usually starts. By 1955, the story had assembled a full mythology around it. A princess in love with a divorced man, a church that wouldn't move, a government that said no. She gave him up for duty, the defining romantic tragedy of post-war Britain. Almost all of that framing is wrong, and the part that's wrong matters most. She wasn't told no, she was given a price. The price had been itemized, in writing, by people whose professional function was itemizing things. And on the 31st of October, 1955, she issued a statement from Clarence House saying she had decided not to pay it, in language that somebody else had at least partly helped her write. The statement is still in the public record. So are the cabinet documents that preceded it, released by the National Archives in January 2004, 2 years after her death. Between the mythology and the documents, there is a significant gap. Most accounts of this story settle into one of two framings. One centers on the Church of England, Archbishop Fisher, ecclesiastical doctrine, the constitutional problem of the supreme governor. The other reduces the question to a financial headline, a single figure that circulates widely without a Hansard citation to support it. Both framings are partial. The Church's position was real and documented, but it addressed one specific question: whether a ceremony would happen inside a church. The financial question is equally real, but the figure most often attached to it turns out to be a composite of statutory civil list income and estimated private crown estate revenue, a construction that does not appear in cabinet papers. The documents describe something more precise than either framing allows, and the answer they give is, in important ways, more surprising. She could have married him and kept most of what she had. The Royal Marriages Act of 1772, 12 George III, Chapter 11, is where the legal structure begins. George III had pushed the act through Parliament after 2 of his brothers made marriages he considered unsuitable. One of those brothers, the Duke of Cumberland, had secretly married a widow. The other, the Duke of Gloucester, had secretly married a countess. The act George III obtained was, in its way, a family document. A father's attempt to institutionalize control over his descendants' choices, written into law, binding on every descendant of George II, with one narrow exception for the offspring of princesses who married into foreign houses. The operative text of Section 1 is exact. No descendant of the body of King George II shall be capable of contracting matrimony without the previous consent of His Majesty, his heirs, or successors, signified under the Great Seal and declared in council. Every marriage made without that consent is, in the Act's own words, null and void to all intents and purposes whatsoever. Not merely voidable, not subject to discretionary correction. Void. Applied abroad as well as at home, parliamentary briefings and the Sussex peerage case both confirm the Act's extraterritorial reach. That covers royals below a threshold the Act specifies. Then comes Section 2, which changes the calculation for those who have lived long enough to trigger it, in case any such descendant of the body of His late Majesty King George II, being above the age of 25 years, shall persist in his or her resolution to contract a marriage disapproved of or dissented from by the king, his heirs, or successors, that then such descendant, upon giving notice to the King's Privy Council, which notice is hereby directed to be entered in the books thereof, may, at any time from the expiration of 12 calendar months after such notice given to the Privy Council as aforesaid, contract such marriage, and his or her marriage with the person before proposed and rejected may be duly solemnized without the previous consent of His Majesty, his heirs, or successors, and such marriage shall be good, as if this act had never been made, unless both Houses of Parliament shall, before the expiration of the said 12 months, expressly declare their disapprobation of such intended marriage. Read that clause. 12 months' notice to the Privy Council. Then, absent a formal vote of disapproval from both Houses of Parliament, the marriage is valid, without the sovereign's consent. The notice goes to the Privy Council, not to Parliament. Parliament's role is purely negative. It can block, but only if both houses expressly vote to do so within the 12-month window. Princess Margaret was born on 21st August 1930. She turned 25 on 21st August 1955. The New York Times ran a front-page story that day explaining that she could now, in principle, wed without her sister's approval. The mechanism described in Section 2 of an act passed when George Washington was still surveying land had just clicked open for the first time in her lifetime. Before that birthday, the Queen's refusal was final and complete. After it, the Queen's refusal was merely the starting point. Section 2 gave Margaret a statutory route around it, provided she was willing to register her intention with the Privy Council, wait 12 months in full public view, and survive Parliament's scrutiny without a formal two-house vote of disapproval. One important fact about that escape clause: it had never been used. Debretz confirms this directly. The Law Library of Congress describes it as an escape clause that hasn't been used. The mechanism had existed in law since 1772, but no descendant of George II had ever activated it. The reason is obvious from the structure. 12 months of a publicly announced royal marriage proposal sitting before Parliament, open to debate, amendment, and condemnation, wasn't a desirable position for any royal or any government. This explains what happened in 1953. When the coronation forecourt story broke in the press, the cabinet under Winston Churchill faced a specific legal question: what to do about a princess under 25 who had, by private accounts, already agreed to marry a divorced group captain. Townsend was posted to Brussels as heir attaché to the British Embassy. The government's working answer was, wait until she's 25. After that, the problem would be constitutionally different and more manageable. So Townsend went to Brussels in the summer of 1953. He and Margaret wrote to each other almost every day for 2 years. Then, August 1955 arrived. Prime Minister by that point was Anthony Eden. Churchill had stepped down in April. Eden had his own biographical complication with this file. He was a divorcee. He had ended his marriage to Beatrice Becket in 1950 and married Clarissa Churchill, Winston's niece, in 1952. The politician now tasked with constructing the constitutional route for a royal to marry a divorced man had done exactly that himself, 3 years earlier. Contemporary press noted the irony. Eden apparently had personal sympathy for the couple's position, though his professional role required him to manage the constitutional machinery rather than act on that sympathy. The Lord Chancellor's view in 1955 adds another layer. According to a Guardian report on the 2004 National Archives release, drawing on file LCO 26352 from the Lord Chancellor's office, the Lord Chancellor told Eden that he regarded the Royal Marriages Act as out of date and an embarrassment, and was not even sure it applied to the princess. This is a single-sourced uncertainty, not a definitive legal opinion, and later parliamentary briefings continued to treat the act as applicable. But it tells you something about the atmosphere in which Eden was working. The legal architecture was being questioned at its foundations by the very officials responsible for it. The Church of England's objection in 1955 rested not on Fisher's personal views, but on formal doctrine that predated him by 17 years. The operative instrument was the 1938 marriage resolutions of the Convocations of Canterbury and York, both convocations adopting resolutions that affirmed Christian marriage as a lifelong and indissoluble union of one man and one woman, and that The church shouldn't allow the use of the marriage service in the case of anyone who has a former partner still living. That is the named document, not the Archbishop's disapproval, not ecclesiastical politics, a resolution of the Convocations, passed in 1938, reaffirming the 1930 Lambeth Conference position and confirmed again in the 1957 Act of Convocation, which came 2 years after Margaret's decision, but largely restated doctrine already in place. Those resolutions wouldn't be formally rescinded until the General Synod voted to allow the remarriage of divorced persons in church in certain circumstances in July 2002, 47 years after the crisis, and 5 months after Margaret's death. Archbishop Geoffrey Fisher, the 99th Archbishop of Canterbury, had been in post since 1945. He met Margaret privately on 27 October 1955, 4 days before her statement. The meeting lasted approximately 1 hour at Lambeth Palace. His chaplain's response to press inquiries, "I can't give any information about it." Fisher's public statement once the announcement was made is one of the more carefully observed ecclesiastical remarks of the decade. What a wonderful person the Holy Spirit is. Whether that sentence signals surprise or foreknowledge can't be settled from the available record. Fisher was operating inside doctrine that had been institutionally established long before he was appointed. His own Wikipedia entry notes that one of Fisher's aims during his 16 years as Archbishop was to make the position of the Church about the marriage of divorced people widely understood. Peter Townsend's former wife, Rosemary, remained alive. Under the 1938 resolutions, that was the operative fact. No church ceremony was available. Here is a precision the popular account consistently misses. The Church of England in 1955 didn't prohibit civil marriage. The New York Times, reporting on 1 November 1955, stated this explicitly. The Church's position was against remarriage in church. It didn't bar members from contracting civil marriages and didn't automatically deny communion to those who did. The 1957 Act of Convocation prohibited public services for those who contracted civil marriages after divorce, not the civil marriages themselves. The Church said, "Not here, not in a church, not with our ceremony." It didn't say, "Not at all." This distinction mattered enormously because a civil ceremony, a register office, not a church service, was explicitly part of the government's plan. The Queen's role as Supreme Governor sharpened the constitutional problem specifically at the church ceremony end. Elizabeth II, as Supreme Governor under the Act of Supremacy 1558, was the formal constitutional head of an institution whose established doctrine her sister would be violating in a church marriage. Approving a church remarriage for Margaret would put the Supreme Governor in the position of officially endorsing something the Convocations had twice resolved against. A civil ceremony removed that problem, which is precisely why it appeared in the plan. The civil list question is where the popular account and the documentary record diverge most sharply. The statutory instrument is the Civil List Act 1952, 15 and 16 George VI and 1st Elizabeth II, Chapter 37. Section 5 of that act carries the heading, Provision for Her Royal Highness the Princess Margaret in the event of her marriage. Its operative text, in the event of the marriage of Her Royal Highness the Princess Margaret, there shall be paid to Her Royal Highness during her life the yearly sum of £9,000 to commence from the date of her marrying. Section 5 then confirms this sum would be in addition to any payment under Section 6 of the Civil List Act 1937. The Hansard record of the House of Commons debate on 9 July 1952 is precise. Princess Margaret, £9,000 in the event of her marriage, in addition to any sum payable to her under Section 6 of the Civil List Act 1937. The pre-existing allowance under the 1937 arrangements came to approximately £6,000 per year. The verified civil list package on marriage, £15,000 per year. That is the confirmed statutory figure. Parliament voted it. The Act enacted it. Now comes the part the popular narrative consistently gets wrong. The Civil List Act 1952 contains no forfeiture clause. Section 5 grants the £9,000 during her life from the date of marriage. It does not condition that payment on retained succession rights, continued HRH status, royal residence, or continuation of public duties. Any government that wanted to remove that money would have needed to pass new primary legislation, a political choice requiring a parliamentary vote, not an automatic legal consequence of a marriage or a renunciation of succession. When Cabinet was advising Eden on the practical terms of a possible marriage in October 1955, the official advice was explicit. The Guardian, reporting in January 2004 on documents released under the extended archival rule applied to royal matters, described the position plainly. Margaret was secretly given a categorical assurance by Downing Street that she could keep her HRH title and a civil list income of £15,000 if she married Townsend and renounced succession rights. BBC News magazine, summarizing the same archive material in 2016, was more comprehensive. The agreed plan under which Margaret could marry Townsend would have preserved her royal title, her civil list allowance, her residence in Britain, and her continuation of public duties. The only constitutional price was renunciation of her own and any future children's succession rights, paired with a civil ceremony rather than a church service. That framing differs substantially from what the public understood in 1955, and from what Townsend himself told the BBC in 1978, that Margaret would have been stripped of practically everything. Earlier accounts, drawing on a 1958 biography and various pre-2004 secondary sources, described a Bill of Renunciation, modeled on the Edward VIII precedent: loss of title, income, residences, exile. The declassified final plan contradicts that picture. The punitive version of the invoice circulated widely in 1955 as a press assumption and remained the accepted version for nearly 5 decades. The paperwork, when it opened, told a different story, which makes the invoice less dramatic than the mythology, but no less real. 2 items: succession rights surrendered, ceremony civil. Everything else, retained. She still chose not to pay it. Eden's government produced multiple drafts of documents in late October 1955. These survive in the Cabinet Office and Prime Minister's Office papers, the CAB and Prem series at the National Archives, released under the extended rule in January 2004. The documents include a draft speech for Eden to deliver in Parliament in the event of the marriage going ahead, a confidential draft letter to Commonwealth Prime Ministers explaining the proposal, a document referred to in some accounts as a summary of procedure, setting out the sequence: Margaret writes to the Queen expressing her wish to marry and her renunciation of succession rights. The Queen consults UK and Commonwealth governments. Legislation introduced as required. And draft letters intended for Margaret to send to the Queen. One version of such a draft, reported by the New York Times on 3 January 2004, contains this language: I have come to the conclusion that in all the circumstances, the best course for me to follow is to marry PT and give up my rights to the succession. That letter was never sent. The drafts confirm that Eden's government had done the bureaucratic work. The route was mapped, the Commonwealth letters were written, the parliamentary speech was ready. The National Archives catalog records a document dated 15th August 1955, described as possible marriage between HRH, the Princess Margaret, and Group Captain Peter Townsend, confirming the documentary trail for this period. What was needed was a decision from the person who would have to live with it. 6 days before her 25th birthday, Margaret had written to Eden from Balmoral. The letter is handwritten. In it, she says she will see Townsend in October. It's only by seeing him in this way that I feel I can properly decide whether I can marry him or not. She adds that the Queen knows she is writing and asks Eden to treat the contents as a confidence. She expects to inform him of her decision by November. This isn't the letter of a woman straining against institutional barriers. It's the letter of a woman who, at 24 years and 359 days, was still deciding. On 1st October, Eden traveled to Balmoral. Townsend had returned from Brussels. He and Margaret were meeting again, at dinners hosted by friends in Berkshire, at Clarence House, entering and leaving separately to manage the press pack that had encamped around them. On 27th October, Margaret visited Fisher at Lambeth Palace. An hour later, she left. His chaplain declined to say what they had discussed. 4 days after that, the statement went out from Clarence House. Shortly after 7 in the evening on October 31st, 1955, BBC Radio interrupted its scheduled programming to read a statement from Princess Margaret. The full text: I would like it to be known that I have decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. I have been aware that, subject to my renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible for me to contract a civil marriage. But mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble, and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before others. I have reached this decision entirely alone, and in doing so, I have been strengthened by the unfailing support and devotion of Group Captain Townsend. I am deeply grateful for the concern of all those who have constantly prayed for my happiness. Pay close attention to the second sentence. I have been aware that, subject to my renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible for me to contract a civil marriage. This is Margaret, in her own statement, confirming that she knew the route existed. She does not claim she was forbidden. She states that she was aware of the option and chose not to take it. The precise legal conditions, succession renounced, civil ceremony, appear in her own words. The reasons she gives are the Church's teaching on indissolubility and her duty to the Commonwealth.
She does not cite financial loss. She does not cite loss of title. She does not mention residences or staff. She names the doctrine. Christian marriage is indissoluble, which is the 1938 Convocation Resolution expressed in plain language. She names the Commonwealth duty, which connects to the constitutional management Eden had been running through his preparatory Commonwealth letters since at least October. Then, I have reached this decision entirely alone. The authorship of that statement is genuinely contested at the primary source level, and the record does not resolve it cleanly. Government drafts of possible announcements, for either outcome, marriage or not, exist in the National Archives as products of Cabinet Office and Prime Minister's Office staff. Some accounts suggest Townsend participated in shaping the final wording. Some point toward palace officials. Fisher's specific drafting role is speculated, but not confirmed by primary document. What can be said: multiple institutional actors had interests in how the decision was framed. The government had prepared language in advance, and the statement bears the marks of careful drafting, precise, doctrinally literate, constitutionally calibrated, free of anything that might invite a legal challenge or a press correction. Whether Margaret composed every word or approved language that had been prepared around her can't be settled from what the archives have so far yielded. The statement absorbs the question. I have reached this decision entirely alone. If that sentence was written for her, it's the most perfectly enclosed institutional irony in the entire story. The act of claiming sole authorship of a decision in language someone else may have provided. What the statement isn't, and can't be read as, is the statement of a woman who was prohibited. It's the statement of a woman who acknowledged an available route and explained why she wouldn't take it. By declining to renounce her succession rights and contract a civil marriage with Townsend,
Margaret retained the following, each item worth naming precisely, because the popular account has persistently misstated the ledger. Her style. Her Royal Highness the Princess Margaret. The categorical assurance from Downing Street had confirmed she would keep it even if she married Townsend. By not marrying him, there was nothing to assure. The title remained. Her place in the line of succession, a position she held until births of the Queen's children and grandchildren, moved her further back, as they inevitably did. Her civil list provision. Before marriage, she continued receiving the existing allowance under the 1937 Act arrangements, approximately £6,000 per year. When she married Anthony Armstrong Jones on 6 May 1960 at Westminster Abbey in the first televised royal wedding, the Civil List Act 1952's Section 5 marriage provision activated. The additional £9,000 per year began from that date. Total package, £15,000 per year. By 1985, the Hansard record shows her civil list provision at £113,100, adjusted upward by order under the Civil List Act. By the time of her death, the figure was £219,000 per year. Her apartment at Kensington Palace. Following the 1960 marriage, she and Armstrong Jones, Earl of Snowdon from that day, initially occupied apartment 10 while apartment 1A was comprehensively rebuilt. She remained there until her death in February 2002. Her public role, sustained and active. Townsend moved back to Belgium voluntarily. He married Marie-Luce Germania in 1959, 20 years old, a Belgian tobacco heiress, and had 2 daughters and a son with her. In 1978, 3 months before his BBC Valentine's Day interview promoting Time and Chance, Margaret became the first British royal since George I to divorce, ending the marriage to Armstrong Jones formally after a decade of estrangement. He said in that 1978 interview that he believed she had made the right decision in 1955. He also said, "I was hardly enough to compensate for these very serious, admittedly material losses that the princess would have to suffer. She would have been stripped of practically everything." Those words represent what Townsend understood the conditions to have been. The 2004 archives suggest the final plan was considerably less punitive than that understanding. But Townsend was operating on the information available in 1955, and the pre-2004 understanding of the terms was harsher than what Eden's government had actually constructed. He wasn't alone in that reading. The punitive version circulated as fact for nearly 5 decades. The estate Margaret left at her death in February 2002 was valued at £7.7 million. The civil list, the title, the apartment, the public role, all of it intact, all of it the direct consequence of a choice she made in the autumn of 1955. 5 years after the statement from Clarence House, Margaret married Armstrong Jones and honeymooned aboard HMY Britannia through the Caribbean. During that voyage, the yacht anchored off Mystique, an island 18 miles south of St. Vincent in the Grenadines, which Colin Tennant had purchased in 1958 for approximately £45,000. Tennant was a British aristocrat and socialite, born in 1926, whom Margaret had known socially for years. His wife Anne was one of Margaret's ladies-in-waiting. Lady Glenconner, as Anne Tennant would become, is the author of the 2019 memoir Lady in Waiting, My Extraordinary Life in the Shadow of the Crown, an eyewitness account that is the closest available primary source to events on Mystique. Tennant reportedly asked Margaret whether she would prefer a wrapped gift or a piece of land. She looked at a map of Mystique, pointed to a 10-acre headland at the island's southern tip, overlooking both the Caribbean Sea and the Atlantic, and chose it. He gave it to her as a wedding present. Lady Glenconner confirmed in a Town & Country interview. Colin famously gave Princess Margaret a plot of land and a home on Mystique as a wedding present following her 1960 marriage to Anthony Armstrong Jones. The Wikipedia entry for Les Jolies Hauts, the villa she eventually built, records the land as 10 acres, given as a wedding present to Princess Margaret in 1959 by Colin Tennant. 8 years after the gift, construction began. The villa was designed by Oliver Messel, Lord Snowdon's uncle, a leading British theatre designer who had settled in the Caribbean for health reasons and had already built villas in Barbados. Messel built a single-story stone structure with 5 bedrooms, a drawing room with glass-paneled doors opening onto the Atlantic view, a garden of calla lilies, oleanders, hibiscus, and bougainvillea, and a pool positioned so that swimmers were level with the Caribbean horizon. The structure was completed in 1972. Margaret called it the only square inch she owned. In 2003, Tennant said of Messel's achievement, "Oliver had instilled the essence of the West Indies in a little cottage. It gave Princess Margaret the greatest possible pleasure not to be reminded of the grandeur of what she was." In 1996, she gave the property to her son David as a wedding present, as Tennant had given it to her. David sold it in 1999 for £2.4 million, reportedly to his mother's distress. The story sometimes told about Mystique, that Margaret was forced into building a villa there, or that she purchased the land, is wrong on both counts. The land was a gift. The house was built 8 years after the gift, by her own decision, to her own specifications. Lady Glenconnor's account is clear. The Les Jolies Hauts Wikipedia entry is clear. The 2003 Architectural Digest documentation is clear. Tennant gave it. Messel built it. Margaret kept it for the rest of her life. The version of this story that most people carry has 3 moving parts: a princess in love, an institution that said no, a woman who surrendered to duty. All 3 elements exist and are real in some form, but the framing, forbidden, sacrificed, refused, misses the structural fact that the documents establish. There was a route. Anthony Eden's government built it, drafted it, ran it past the Queen, and circulated preparatory language to Commonwealth governments. The Church's 1938 Convocation Doctrine provided for a civil alternative, not a church service, but a civil ceremony, which was explicitly incorporated into the plan. The Royal Marriages Act's Section 2 provided a statutory mechanism that, while never used, had existed since 1772 and had been activated by Margaret's 25th birthday. The Civil List Act, 1952, contained no forfeiture clause. Downing Street provided a categorical assurance that her title was safe. The price, as the 2004 archives recorded, was succession rights, hers and any future children's, and a register office rather than a church service. Not exile, not financial ruin, not removal from the royal family, not loss of title, not loss of income, not departure from Kensington Palace. She read the invoice. She acknowledged it in writing, in the statement issued from Clarence House at shortly after 7 in the evening on October 31, 1955. I have been aware that, subject to my renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible for me to contract a civil marriage. She named the civil option. She named the succession condition. She then named the reasons she wouldn't proceed. 5 years after she declined, a man she knew from parties handed her 10 acres of a Caribbean island as a wedding present, and she kept it for the rest of her life and called it the only square inch she owned. It wasn't. She owned very little and was given a great deal. And the difference between those 2 things is the whole architecture of her life. In 1955, she was offered a man and asked to hand back a position in the succession and the right to a church ceremony. She declined. The rest, the title, the income, the apartments, the staff, the public role, the decades of civil list payments, remained exactly where it had been the morning before the statement was read on the radio. Nobody made that decision for her. No archbishop and no sister and no act of parliament constructed the answer she gave. They wrote down what it would cost and then they let her read it.